Welcome, brave listeners, to Wilhelm Presents Frightening Tales. I am your host, Wilhelm. Tune in each week where I entertain my listeners with another dark and creepy tale of the paranormal, donated by authors from around the world. If you're an author of some paranormal fiction and would like to share a story with my listeners, submit one at frighteningtales.com. And while you're there, tune in for more than 40 hours of previous content. Today's episode is by Paul Leone, a Western New York author whose cat is not at all interested in his overly large collection of bad movies. Paul grew up on a diet of Tolkien, Lewis, Lucas, Roddenberry, Stoker, monster movies, and comic books. Today's tale is called In the Cards. London, 1969. It was a summer afternoon in London, and Violet Axford was lounging with her mates at Billy O'Donnell's flat in a particularly squalid corner of Soho, miles away from her own stolidly middle-class row house in Peckham. It was just her, Lazy Rachel, Billy O, and his girl, and a few of Billy's mates from the neighborhood. Actors and whores, most of them, Violet suspected, thrilled at the rebellion by proximity. The marijuana was even more thrilling in a mellow sort of way. Violet wasn't sure thrilling and mellow really went together, and giggled about it for a bit after it was her turn with the bong. Did you hear that Elizabeth Blake's back in town? That was one of Billy's theater friends, a gangly redhead from Liverpool. His name was Jerry, or Jeff, something like that. Who's that? Violet asked. She couldn't help but smiling as she did. It was almost entirely oblivious to the way it made a few of the boys grin back like wolves. Her? She's our guru, love. He winked at her. Our very own Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Ah, you're underselling her, mate, Jerry or Jeff said. She's the real deal, a real lady of the black arts. They say she was one of Aleister Crowley's teachers. Violet had some vague idea who he was, or had been, since he'd been dead for years and years. Hadn't he? A magician or something like that. One of the types that really believed they were doing magic, instead of just tricks. Magic? Or was it magic with a K? Around this crowd, probably magic. Capital M-A-G-I-C-K. His teacher? She must be older than God then, mate, Rachel said. Violet more or less stifled a giggle then. Of course Rachel knew who he was. Might be, but she doesn't look it, Billy said. She don't look a day over 30. It's magic, is it, Jerry? Violet was sure it was Jerry now, said. Just after that, he fell asleep and started snoring like a baby. Still, Violet noticed Rachel shiver a little at the conviction in the stone scoutser's voice. Fortunately for Rachel, the talk moved away from Crowley and magic, and soon enough she abandoned them anyway. 3 weeks later, at a pub near Billy's flat, the gang was together again. How'd you like to meet her? Billy asked Rachel, in a conspiratorial whisper. He almost winked as he did. Before Rachel joined them, they'd talked all about it already. Talked and decided. Who? The bloody Queen Mother? Rachel asked. Billy laughed.
No, Black Elizabeth. Well, Elizabeth Blake, I mean.
Really?
Really? What'd you think?
Think it'd be brilliant. Violet smiled nastily at Rachel, and she wasn't the only one. But the blonde missed it entirely. She was too busy staring at Billy with her brown cow eyes. The meeting with Black Elizabeth was at a private room in a restaurant in the West End, an expensive place called Zara's. But Violet didn't think about how costly it was, and how silly the food probably was. Once she laid eyes on Elizabeth, the woman was startlingly attractive. Not at all what Violet had expected for a magic maker. To begin with, she was young, not a day over 30, which puzzled Violet. How could someone that age have taught Crowley anything? She couldn't have been more than a child when he died. Young, attractive, tall, and smartly dressed compared to Violet and her mates. They were seated all around a long table. Violet, Billy, Jerry, Rachel, and Black Elizabeth. The alleged guru of magic had a deck of large, ornate cards in her hands. Tarot cards. Fancy ones at that. They must have cost a few quid. Elizabeth held them up for all to see. Behold the cards. Crowley's deck, as they call it. Behold the cards. Crowley's deck, as they call it. There was a brief, bitter smile on her face and a hint, just the barest hint, of West Country in her voice. As they call it.
Oi, do me up,
Violet said, her eagerness amplified by a glass or two of wine. Elizabeth looked at her, and there might have been something strange in her glance, but Violet didn't notice.
All right then,
Elizabeth said with a sly smile. She shuffled the cards, slowly at first, but faster and faster, until hands and cards alike were practically a blur. Violet stared enthralled as Elizabeth began laying the cards down in a circle, or something like that. Maybe it was more apt to call it a triangle. 2 cards slightly overlapping, a space, 2 more cards, another space, and the last 3, or were they the first?
This is the Ouroboros spread. There are some who call it the Devil's spread.
Elizabeth smiled.
Do you see? 3 pairs. Past, present, future. The first cards lead to its partner. In each case, turn them over. Start with the one nearest to you.
Violet giggled as she took the card and looked at it, and then laughed.
It knows me, the deck does,
she said, holding up a card with a golden-haired nymph on it. It read 11, Cupidatus.
Lost,
Elizabeth said. The only thing wrong was the hair. She was a redhead, not blonde like Rachel.
Again,
Elizabeth said. 2 people coupled together. The vivid image left almost nothing to the imagination, and Violet could have sworn the pair were writhing just a little. 7, Amantes.
The lovers. First desire, then the consummation. Again, the first of the second pair.
Violet reached out and then recoiled, startled when Elizabeth hissed impatiently.
Anti-clockwise, Carol. Oh, right then.
Violet pursed her lips as she flipped over the third card. A capering jester with a harlequin mask. Fatuous.
The fool. Confusion and bewilderment. Ha! Too right it knows you,
Billy said with a mocking laugh.
Shut it!
Violet flipped over the next card without being told. It showed a copper hammer and tongs. Some trick of the light gave them a rusty tint just as Violet turned the card up. 14 R's.
Art, craft, cunning work. Again.
Bronze scales, one side weighed down by something invisible. Justitia.
Justice. Or at least judgment. Again.
A medieval plague doctor in a white funeral shroud. 13 Morse.
Death. It means change, yeah?
Violet asked. She smiled nervously as she did. Her stomach was fluttering and she felt a hint of color in her cheeks even if nobody around saw any red.
Sometimes it does.
Elizabeth swept up the cards and started to shuffle them.
One more divination, I think.
She looked at each of the young people and then pointed at Rachel.
Me? Are you afraid?
Rachel scoffed.
Lay them out then.
Violet barely paid attention as Elizabeth shuffled, quick as a cat, and then dealt the cards again. 19 Solace. Pleasure. 11 Cupidatus. Lust. 18 Luna. Deception. 4 Imperator. Realization. 15 Diabolus. Destiny. And finally 13 Moors. Rachel made a face and Violet almost giggled at how nervous the other girl looked. Never mind how nervous she herself felt, but it was an exhilarating sort of nervous. Like she was about to parachute out of an airplane.
Bit grim, isn't it? Your fortune-telling,
Rachel asked the magic woman.
Life's not a Walt Disney cartoon, dear,
Elizabeth said, sneering as she did. Soon enough, the evening was over. Billy and Rachel went off together, Rachel still looking unsettled. Violet was uncomfortable herself, but she hid it.
Wait a moment, dear.
Violet started and then giggled as she turned to face Elizabeth.
Yeah, I mean, yes.
Elizabeth smiled and made Violet feel comfortable.
I'm ever so sorry if I upset you with the cards. Permit me to make up for it. Ow. I've been invited to a party in Purefleet. It would delight me if you'd come. Consider it an apology and an invitation at the same time.
Violet hesitated, but Elizabeth smiled again, and she found herself nodding and saying yes, almost without realizing it.
Delightful, dear. Delightful.
She flicked her wrist and handed Violet an old-fashioned card that had appeared almost by magic between two fingers. Violet took it. It felt warm and looked at it. The back was completely done in red ink. For just a second, as she flipped it over, Violet was sure she saw patterns there, or even a hint of motion, just as with the card a little while ago. But she didn't turn it back and look like a gawking idiot like Rachel to Elizabeth. Instead, she read what was on the front. A name, Violet guessed, although not an English one. Vasila Dragic. And 2 addresses, 138 Piccadilly in London, and Purfleet House, London Road, Purfleet.
Wow,
Violet said.
this Dragic fellow must be well off. Quite so,
Elizabeth confirmed with a slight smile.
I hope your Friday evening is free. Absolutely,
Violet said, smiling back. She felt giddy. Elizabeth laid a hand on Violet's shoulder. Splendid, dear. Splendid. A few days later, Violet fussed with her hair as she stepped up to the wrought iron gate on London Road. She'd done her best, rented a nice dress, spent almost an hour on her hair and her makeup and everything, and she just hoped it looked okay compared to all the rich people that were sure to attend a party like this. She bit her lip a little. The gate was shut and there was no buzzer or anything. How was she supposed to get in? Was this some kind of joke? Just as she thought that, the gate split and slid open with just the faintest rasp of iron on asphalt and the crunch of a dry summer leaf getting ground to bits.
Well, that's better,
Violet said under her breath before heading up the sidewalk at a very careful pace. She hardly ever wore high heels and didn't want to look stupid for it. A few minutes later, she reached the entrance. There were 4 slender stone columns supporting a sloping roof over the front porch, with iron bars between the columns. The bars weren't fitted right, or something, because Violet could hear a faint creaking noise that made her teeth hurt. It reminded her of something she couldn't remember. Just as she raised her hand to ring the bell, the door swung open. A tall, aquiline man stood there, clad in a dark suit and with long black hair and long but carefully trimmed beard and mustache. "Miss Axford?" he asked smoothly, in a voice as rich as fine wine. Violet blushed and then nodded. Then she remembered her manners and curtsied in a wobbly sort of way.
Mr. Dragic?
"I am he." The man took her hand and bowed deeply. "And you are, without doubt, Miss Violet Axford. You are even lovelier than dear Elizabeth said." Violet, suddenly at a loss for words, nodded. Dragic rose, his gloved hand still wrapped around her bare one. "Enter freely and of your own will." Violet's blush deepened.
Thank you, sir,
She said in a bit of a rush.
Oh, I hope I'm not late.
"Not at all, my dear. We were waiting for you. In fact," he said, gently guiding Violet over the threshold. The door slammed shut behind her. Thank you, brave listeners, for joining me on another dark story. I urge my listeners to go out and find more content by our weekly author. If you're not too timid, that is. If you're looking for more information on Paul Leone, visit him at paul-leone.com. That's Leone.com. If you enjoyed today's story and you've tuned in on YouTube, please click the like button. And if you don't want to miss future stories, click the old subscribe button. If you were present today on Spotify and enjoyed the story, you're more than welcome to leave a comment. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave the show a rating as you see fit. All these things, wherever you listen, help out. Oh, and please do me a favor and share today's story if you can. Then tune in next week for another frightening tale. If you're brave enough.